Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Firearm purchaser licensing requirements like background checks and fingerprinting vary widely from state to state, but research shows that policies like these can actually help address homicides and suicides. In today's episode, researchers Silvia Villareal and Josh Horwitz talk about a new report that identifies 5 ideal components to include in licensing, why these policies can be key in actually addressing deaths from gun violence, and how, in the inverse, taking away these requirements can actually result in more deaths. Let's listen. Silvia Villareal and Josh Horwitz, thanks so much for coming back on Public Health on Call. Today, we're going to talk about firearm purchaser licensing. But first, we kind of want to understand what that is and what it entails. So, Silvia, can you talk a little about that?
Firearm purchaser licensing is what some people know as permit to purchase, and it is exactly what its name says. It is a system that requires individuals to obtain a license before being able to buy a gun. And the intention here is very similar to that of a driver's license, where you need to prove that you can safely operate a car before driving. So we are applying the same logical principle to firearms. And the end goal is simple. It is to enhance public safety by strengthening the screening layers that can help state verifies that only people who are eligible can legally purchase firearms. And, some people might think, well, isn't that what background checks are for? And yes, the answer is yes, but also no. So firearm purchaser licensing laws and what we call FPLs are more comprehensive than universal background checks. And for instance, they can prevent impulsive gun purchasing, which in turn may reduce the number of guns that are available to be resold, stolen, or used in crime. And they require prospective buyers to provide more identifying information to get their license. And this can also deter straw purchasing and in turn limit the availability of guns that are used in the underground market. At the same time, they can also increase the accountability that exists between sellers and purchasers to better identify and screen out persons that are too risky to purchase guns, which again means fewer guns in the hands of those who are at risk of harming themselves or others. At the end of the day, research evidence shows that firearm purchaser licensing laws are effective. They are associated with significant reductions in gun violence, and more specifically, many studies have shown that they are effective at reducing gun homicides in urban areas, at reducing suicide. They lead to fewer crime guns and reductions in mass shootings and even shootings of police.
Okay. So, Josh, why are we talking about firearm purchaser licensing right now? Why this moment?
Well, I think we've seen historic rises in both firearm homicide and firearm suicide and police shootings. I think we've been fortunate in some regards. We've seen the homicide rate decrease in the last 2 years, but it's still elevated from any normal situation. And the firearm suicide rate continues to go up. I think we've had a lot of discussion about what to do about firearms. And some people just put their hands up in despair and say, what can we do? But this is one of those things that's kind of right in front of our face. And here's why firearm purchaser licensing matters. We've had these discussions. Do we need new laws? Do we need to enforce the laws? Firearm purchaser licensing makes every firearm law better. It really is the enforcement mechanism. When people say, how do you enforce the law? You make sure people comply with the law. And you do that by having a robust firearm purchaser licensing system. What Silvia mentioned about having really thorough background checks, enough time for law enforcement to doing those checks, fingerprinting to make sure that we have the best identification we possibly can, and that we're pinging against the system that'll work. Some of them don't work on names. Some of them work on fingerprints or a combination of both. It really really is, it's an enforcement mechanism. But what's most important is it's right under our faces right now. It's right in front of us. We are seeing states that have firearm purchaser licensing getting strong, robust results in stopping homicide, suicide, reducing violence against law enforcement, reducing shootings by police. I mean, across the board, it's right in front of us. And you're seeing the states who do this really get great results. So it's right in front of us. Its time is right. We talk a lot about enforcing the law. This is how you enforce the law.
One other thing I want to add in here, and we will link to this report in the show notes so people can see all of your takeaways, but these laws are also pretty popular. Can you talk a little about that?
They are. I mean, this is the interesting thing. So firearm purchaser licensings are supported by a majority across the board, whether it's Democrat, Republican, gun owner, non-gun owner. And one of the things that's interesting is that gun owners in states that have licensing are very supportive of it. And so people who are involved with this process, they realize it's not overly burdensome. It's like getting, a driver's license for your car. And people understand that process, and it actually works. So we have popularity and we have results. Put those two things together and you have a powerful public health intervention.
Now, Silvia, you mentioned before that there's a bunch of different components that go along with this, and they tend to vary state by state. Your report looks at a lot of these different requirements and makes a recommendation about what an ideal firearm purchasing law procedure would look like. Can you talk a little bit about what those components would be?
First recommendation that we're making is firearm safety training. And again, just like driver's education, gun buyers need to show that they know how to safely use or store a firearm. The second one is fingerprinting, which helps law enforcement agencies to track the guns that are used in crimes and deter their misuse. It's just an extra layer for screening. The third recommendation that we're making is having an in-person step through the application process. This can be just as simple as fingerprinting. But when adding an in-person element, buyers need a direct interaction with authorities or law enforcement, which can discourage individuals who are high risk from getting a gun. The fourth one is comprehensive background checks. These background checks go beyond the federal system and to be able to catch persons who might otherwise sometimes slip through the cracks. Finally, last but not least, are the waiting periods. And we're recommending adding waiting periods because they can help to create a buffer between an individual deciding to buy a gun and actually obtaining it. So this can stop or deter impulsive acts of violence, including suicides.
Now, so you've mentioned 5 things here: safety training, fingerprinting, an in-person application, comprehensive background check, and a waiting period. Are there any states that actually have all 5 of those things in place right now in order to get a firearm?
Yeah, so actually there are. We looked at the states that currently have FPL laws in their books, and we found that 11 states and DC have adopted this life-saving law. However, these laws are different across the states, and that's why we looked at the research and the data and found that the most effective components of these laws are these 5 that we were just talking about. For example, states like Delaware, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. have really good firearm purchaser licensing laws with the main elements that we're recommending. But again, looking at the books, at the statutes of each of them, we did find states that had all of them. But it is a bit tricky to say how these elements are being implemented. This especially considering after the pandemic and the COVID-19, where a lot of online processes started to gain traction online. That means that sometimes what they have on the statute when they adopted these laws does not necessarily give us the full picture of how these laws are being implemented in real life.
So you have some great examples of states that maybe have this happening in theory, although maybe perhaps not in practical application just yet. And you also mentioned that there are, every single one of these things is evidence-based in terms of showing an impact on things like homicides and suicides. Let's take just one of these components, and maybe Josh, you want to pick up on this and kind of walk us through what that evidence looks like.
So I think it's important to understand what an enhanced background check looks like. And then I think you realize the importance of it all. So right now at the federal level, if you're just doing when you go to a licensed firearm dealer and you buy a firearm, the federal requirement is that federally licensed dealer has to do a background check. Well, that is a background check that looks at a number of different databases. Some of those databases, by the way, some of them have biometric components, so we don't have that right now in the background check. But if there's any sort of ambiguity, you only have the NICS system, the National Instant Check System, the FBI, only has 3 business days to look at that and try to resolve it. It may require going to local law enforcement, looking at the arrest record. And what we have is something called a default proceed, which means, the NICS examiner, the National Instant Check System may say, wait a minute, there's a yellow light here. We're not sure we should authorize this. They have to after 3 days. So an enhanced background check coupled with the waiting period gives law enforcement at the state level the time to thoroughly figure out what's going on. If there's a need to talk to a local law enforcement, they have time to do that. So when you think about an enhanced background check, it becomes obvious why it's important. You're basically getting rid of that default proceed. You're not getting guns in the hands of people that maybe later you say, oh man, I made a mistake. I have to go and get that gun back. Think about the Charleston shooter years ago who really wreaked havoc and killed people in the church in Charleston. That person should never have had a firearm, but the problem was buried in a local police record, and you needed more than 3 days to identify that. And so that's why when you think about mechanisms, I always like to think, what's the mechanism this works by? And that's the mechanism. That enhanced background check gives law enforcement the time to do it. And the waiting period is actually quite important because giving people, for instance, up to 30 days, doesn't mean they have to take it. But if they need it, it's there to figure it out and get it right. And that way, you're making sure that people who are eligible to have firearms get them, but really sure that when someone needs to be prevented from having a firearm, that law enforcement gets it right.
And one of the things we know from public health is that it's layers. It's not just one intervention that is holding back the dam, right? It's layers of intervention. And so, you mentioned comprehensive background checks, but that's also layered in with fingerprinting, with the in-person application, with, all of these things work together to build some line of defense here. What happens when you start peeling back some of these requirements? Because we've also seen legislation happening in reverse. We've seen things getting peeled back. Can you talk a little bit about that, Josh?
Yeah, and it's really kind of tragic. When you think about peeling back some of these requirements, what you're doing is you're really increasing people who will die by homicide and suicide. And it's tragic. And I often think about the state of Missouri and where they have a high suicide rate, but they also have a high homicide rate in St. Louis and Kansas City. In 2007, I think they made the tragic mistake of rolling back their firearm purchaser licensing law, and they got tragic results. You saw a 25% increase in firearm homicides and a 16% increase in firearm suicides. And you think about protecting those cities and thinking about all the deaths over the years in St. Louis and again in Kansas City, but also Missouri's high suicide rate. You think, what a tragedy. This could have been, they had everything in front of them to stop these, and they didn't. And what you said about layering, what they did is they took off an important layer. So they still have this federal background check requirement, but when you layer these interventions together, you put a safeguard on it so that you're actually enforcing the law. You're not just paying lip service to the law. You have someone who's actually making sure the law gets enforced. Again, Missouri to me is just such a tragedy to see the high level of death there, and it didn't need to happen.
Sylvia, is there anything that you want to add about this conversation around impacts?
Yeah, so we have seen what happened in Missouri when this law was repealed, but we also have success example with Connecticut when Connecticut implemented their firearm purchaser licensing law. In the same way, like you can see the effects. There was a 28% reduction in firearm homicide rate and a 33% reduction on suicide rate. Those are people's lives. Those are real life examples on how this is effective. The percentages, in my opinion, are mind-blowing.
Yeah. So, I mean, just from this conversation, we know that this kind of legislation works. We know that it's bipartisan and that a majority of gun owners support it. We know that it's helping to reduce deaths. Let's close out with you, Josh. What do you want people to take away from this whole conversation and this report?
What I want people to take away is that gun violence is not intractable. In other words, there are solutions that work, that are popular, that we have great evidence for. And I understand that at this moment, the federal government is preoccupied with other things. And it may not be that the federal government is going to deal with gun violence prevention in a major way right now. I mean, it's not great, but what we can do is go to the states and say, you have power too. You have the power to make sure that your state law is layered on top of federal law. You have the power to prevent the loss of lives in your state. And you have a solution that makes a ton of sense that's being implemented right now. We can see it across other states that save lives. So when we think about state level policymaking, this is a ripe opportunity for people to come together with a solution that is right in front of our face.
Well, Silvia Villareal and Josh Horwitz, thank you so much for this conversation. We're going to link to this report about firearm purchaser licensing laws and the 5 core components that you're recommending in the show notes. We appreciate seeing you back on Public Health on Call.
Thank you for having us.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.